those of you, I mean, we've said hello briefly, but I'm Amanda Grenier, and I'm director of the Gilbrea Center here at McMaster. And one of the things we're experimenting with are these seminar series to bring together community members, academics, students, in all areas of aging. So kind of an interdisciplinary approach to aging. So I'm really pleased to hear that everyone in the room actually has a very different background. It's coming in from social sciences, nursing, philosophy, linguistics. So this is great. So what we have, what we'll be doing today, it's a rather informal structure. And we have Magda Stroinska, who will be speaking with us. Roughly 30 minutes or so with a presentation.
35 minutes.
35 minutes, perfect. And we open it up for questions along the way. And are you more comfortable with kind of questions as you're going, or to save them?
I'm comfortable with any setup.
You're comfortable with anything? That's perfect. So a little bit
Feel free to stop me at any point.
Okay, perfect. Thanks, welcome. So a little bit about Magda. She's here in the Department of Linguistics and Languages. And her background, she's professor of German and linguistics. She served as a research fellow at Kingston University in the UK. And her major areas of research are sociolinguistics, cross-cultural communication, cultural stereotyping, language politics. And she has a number of co-edited books and volumes related to stereotypes. I won't try to pronounce. That's a German. My German's not so good. And she's an exile, and she's edited a collection, Exile, Language, and Identity. And she's translated a number of works into Polish. She's currently working on another volume on language and trauma, and continues to study the language of totalitarian regimes and effects in post-communist Eastern Europe. Now today, such a wide background, but today she's speaking with us about Alzheimer's disease and the changes in communication patterns. So I'll turn this floor over to you. Thank you.
And most of those published volumes have been co-edited by my colleague Gilbrea, who is here. So apart from the fact that we have worked a lot in the past together, even this talk is really the result of our collaboration. And we spent some time last night trying to cut the number of slides that I originally produced and trying to discuss who the audience may be. And we decided that we'll probably skip all the slides that are very general and contain information that is probably well familiar to you, and we'll stick to linguistic matters, which is our area of, say, expertise. So what I would like to talk today about is I will start with a brief introduction to why we would like to talk about aging and communication, dementias, Alzheimer's disease in the context of communication. Then I will talk about patterns of communication with people with Alzheimer's disease and how the linguistic notion of Grice and Maxims of Conversation could be applied to communication with people with Alzheimer's. And we will end by talking a little bit about how people with Alzheimer's disease are being portrayed in popular culture, especially in movies, because this is a way of talking about problems of people with dementia in a way that is accessible to very wide audiences. When we talk about communication and aging, we should probably start with the assertion that communication is such a vital part of our daily lives that we actually don't even stop to think what happens when we can no longer communicate. Language is something that we treat as transparent, as air, and we only start noticing when we have problems with communication. In the case of aging, those problems are of different kinds. There are problems related to dementia, there are problems related to physiological aging. In countries like Canada, there is an additional dimension, and this is the cross-cultural dimension, because there are so many people who come from different ethnic backgrounds, and those differences in cultural and linguistic background can create additional barriers in communication, especially for people who, when they get older, actually lose the second language. They may have spent their entire life in Canada speaking English, working in English, or French, but as they age, they actually go back to their first language. And very often people are annoyed when those people request translators or some help, and I often hear comment, well, they should have learned the language. Well, they have learned the language, and then they lost it. So we should not be penalizing them for something that is certainly not their thought. When we talk about communication with Alzheimer's persons, we very often talk about family members and caregivers. And if we look at who actually cares for people with Alzheimer's disease, it is mostly family members. Obviously, there are nursing homes, but communication with and care for Alzheimer's patients is mostly done by family members. And if we were to look at the financial impact of time spent caring for Alzheimer's patients, those are huge amounts of money that are in a way saved because this is care given by family members. Those people who care for Alzheimer's patients very often report high levels of stress. And that stress may be related to financial issues, it may be related to physical stress of actually lifting an elderly person, but a lot of this stress is emotional stress, and this emotional stress is hugely related to communication issues. So it's perhaps communication or actually non-communication issues. Over 60% of family caregivers rated this emotional stress as high or very high. And even if family members with Alzheimer's disease are in a nursing home, family members still report high levels of emotional distress. It may be also cultural, because in some cultures, the idea of letting your parent go to a nursing home is really seen as a failure. You failed as a child. You should have been able to take care of your parent. And it's also a huge reason for stress for the elderly person who has to go to a nursing home, for instance, because someone needs 24-hour care, because they failed as a parent, since their children are not taking care of them. So especially in other cultures, it's seen as a taboo having a parent in a nursing home. So since communication between Alzheimer's disease persons and caregivers is such a major source of stress, we thought that it would be interesting to look at how this communication works or doesn't work, and what could possibly be done in very simple ways to maybe lessen the stress that is related to this. Why is communication with people with Alzheimer's disease so stressful? And if you have had any experience, you probably already know. So what I'm trying to do here is perhaps spell it out and categorize certain problems that may happen in communication. One problem that is often reported is that you are dealing with what seems to be the same person. It's the same face, the same voice, the same intonation, but the words that come out are so much out of character. You seem to be dealing with a person that has gone mad. It's not the same person inside, but it is still the same person outside. And people say things like, I want his body to start all over again so he can recreate himself, because we still see the same body, the same face, but there is something wrong with what is inside. Some people say that the person is no longer there, but when I used those words at a conference in the past, there was a very quick reaction that, well, we cannot say this, the person is still there. If you have read the book Still Alice, I think that's the reading of the title. The person is still there. It's just very difficult to reach to that person. And it's very difficult for that person to reach out to us. So what happens with the communication between caregivers and people with Alzheimer's disease is that this communication seems to be breaking down. And we are blaming people with Alzheimer's disease for being the reason for this communication breakdown. But if you think about it, they cannot do anything about it. they are the victims. Something is happening to them that makes it impossible for them to retain the level of communication ability that they used to have. So it's not that they are the reason for the breakdown. That's how we see this, but they cannot do anything about it. So it makes no sense to blame them. We are blaming them because it's easier and they cannot really defend themselves. So this breakdown is clearly due to a lot of factors, such as, for instance, the fact that an Alzheimer's disease person is forgetting a lot of information, and that they may no longer apply the norms of communication as we know them. They no longer function the way healthy communication partners do, but they seem to be functioning within a different frame of reference. So they are still saying things that seem to make no sense to us, but they cannot help us. So what we can do is perhaps try to understand their frame of reference and try to adapt to the way they see the world. So the idea that it's the same face, but the person is no longer there, to a degree applies. The person as we knew them is perhaps no longer accessible. The face is there, but it's like a face mask. But the person is still there. It's just that we have to find out how to communicate. So we assume that because it's the same face, we are dealing with the same person. But this is not exactly so. We have communication distortion, forgetting and so on, and this creates a lot of frustration. But it's our mistake because we are assuming that the person is not cooperating with us in the conversation based on our parameters. However, when we realize that we are in conversation with someone with a different set of parameters, maybe we can try to start adapting to those changed parameters. So what I would like to do now is I would like to talk a little bit about what makes a good conversation from the linguistic point of view. And I will be talking about the research that has been done by H.P. Grice, who was a pragmatician and philosopher of language, working on the idea of meaning and meaning in conversation. He was a British linguist who passed away in 1988, who first worked at Oxford and then in the US at the University of California at Berkeley. And his main ideas were published in 1989 in a collection of his essays, Studies in the Way of Words. Grice started with the point that conversations are rule-governed. And if they are rule-governed, he wanted to discover what are the rules of conversation. So what makes a good conversation? His starting point was that conversation is an example of cooperation. And he formulated what is called the Co-Operative Principle, which says, make your contribution such as is required at the stage at which it occurs by the accepted purpose or direction of the talk exchange in which you are engaged. So this spells out what we expect a cooperation and conversation based on cooperation to be. What it actually means is that if you are, for instance, fixing a car with a friend, when you ask them for a screwdriver, you expect the person to give you a screwdriver and not a hammer, and to give it to you now, and not to walk away. So we expect that we would try to be helpful and cooperative, and that's what we also expect in conversation. So if we were to try to spell out what cooperation means in conversation, Grice suggests that we can do it by proposing 4 so-called maxims of conversation. The first such maxim is the Maxim of Quality. And it says that we should try to make our contribution one that is true, which pretty much means that we should not say what we believe to be false, and we should not say that for which we lack adequate evidence. So what we say should not be a lie, and we should not gossip, if we were to just put it in simple terms. I would like to know who doesn't do it. So let's say we have a conversation like this one. When can you retire? And B says, any time. Now, is this true or is it not true? If I say that I could retire at any time, it is in a way true. I could retire at any time. But could I retire with full pension? Could I afford to retire? Well, so when I say that I can retire at any time, I'm telling the truth, but it's probably not the full picture.
There's also another ambiguous, what does retire mean? It also means, are you going to go to bed?
Yeah, that could be another meaning, but I think probably in the university setting, retiring to bed happens less often in conversation. So when we say that the maxim of quality is not violated here, yes, it is not violated. I could retire at any time, but I'm still hiding part of the information. I'm not telling you all that has happened. It's a bit like my daughter who brought a cat home and said that she found it. Well, she found it at a pet store. Well, that was true that she found it, but it wasn't the full picture. So the second maxim that Grice suggested was the maxim of quantity, which says, make your contribution as informative as required for the current purpose of the exchange. Do not make your contribution more informative than is required. So we should say all that is necessary, but not more. So we shouldn't go into this verbal, I don't want to say diarrhea, but we don't want to say more than people want to hear. So for instance, here we have a conversation that I had with a TA after the Christmas break. Are you joining us for the meeting? And the TA said, I'm on my way. But I didn't know whether she already came back from holidays abroad. She could have been on a plane, and we were waiting. So me saying I'm on my way is not informative enough. Are you walking through the campus, or are you still coming from the airport? So here the information is true, but again, do we get all the information that we need? The third maxim is the maxim of relevance. Make your contribution relevant. So if we ask a question, we expect an answer that fits the question, that answers the question. And the last manner is the maxim of manner. Be perspicuous and specifically avoid obscurity, avoid ambiguity, be brief, be orderly. In other words, as Grice said, issue obfuscation. So this, I believe, is quite self-explanatory. So if we were to look at Gricean maxims and an example of everyday exchange, let's have a look at this. Suppose that A says to B, I'm out of gas. They are not friends. A runs into a stranger in the street and says, I'm out of gas. And B says, there is a garage around the corner. Now, normally we don't run into strangers and blurt out something like, I'm out of gas. So what A is actually trying to say is, well, I ran out of gas and I'm looking for a gas station where I could refuel. And what B says is, well, I understand why you are asking me, and I know that there is a garage around the corner. Now, we could assume that B also knows that this garage is open and sells gas, because otherwise it would be quite nasty to give this kind of information. But if you look at this, how does it apply Gricean maxims? A comes out of the blue and blurts out a statement, I'm out of gas, which may not be really relevant for the situation. And what B answers has no obvious connection to the question. A says that I'm out of gas, B says something about the garage around the corner. The only way A makes sense of what B said is to assume that B understood that A is asking for information where they could get gas, and that B is trying to do their best to provide this information. So even though this exchange violates the maxim of relevance, B does not answer in a relevant manner, it actually follows the principle of cooperation, and they communicate quite well. Let's have another example. A asks B, do you have the time? And B says, the milkman has just come. Now, again, B's answer seems to be irrelevant to the question. In what way does it make sense?
They probably both know that the milkman comes at a certain time.
Absolutely. So B actually understands that the question doesn't mean do you have the time, because otherwise he could have said yes. That's the answer to a question like, do you have the time? So B doesn't answer yes, but he also understands that it means, do you have the time, and if you do, please tell me. So what he's actually saying is, I don't have the time, but I can give you the best information I have, which is that I have just seen the milkman, and we both know that he comes at 7 a.m. So we violate the maxims, but we are very good at making sense of what people say, because unless we assume that we are dealing with someone who is crazy, we know that people are trying to cooperate, that what they say is meant as being helpful. So what happens here is that we are using the notion that Grice calls conversational implicature, which means that something is meant, implied, or suggested, but it's actually different what is being said. So you say one thing, but you understand something else, because you assume that we are cooperating. So another example, if someone says Tehran is in Turkey, isn't it? And the teacher says, and London is in Armenia, I suppose. We easily interpret it, assuming we know where London is, that it means that Tehran is not in Turkey. So we violate maxims, but we are very good at still making sense of what people are saying. So if we were to understand what conversational implicature is the situation where the person on the left thinks some thought Q, but says something that is like P, knowing that the hearer will still get the information that it's Q. So we think one thing, we say something else, but the hearer still gets our meaning. So this is the explanation of the milkman example, that we get the implied message that this is the best information we can give about when the milkman comes. Now, the question is, do we obey the maxims? And I think we agree that we don't. We don't always tell the truth. We do engage in gossip. We don't always give the right amount of information, especially if one goes to talks. They usually run over time. People don't know when to stop. We are not always orderly. We mix up information. And what we say is not always relevant. So if we don't obey the maxims, why bother? Why would Grice suggest maxims as something that rules conversations? What Grice actually wanted to say is that indeed no one obeys the maxims, but they are not a guide to how we should speak. They are actually a guide to how we interpret of what others say, because we assume that others obey the maxims. In order to make sense of what people say, we make the assumption that unless we have evidence to the contrary, people don't lie. People tell us things in the right order, and what they say is relevant. And even if you don't think about it, that's what you always do. You just assume that people try to say something that you should try to interpret. If a speaker does not follow the maxims, they may obviously violate a maxim by either telling a lie or keeping important information to himself, or they may actually want to mislead us. They may want to tease us. There are all kinds of situations where people say things that are not true. So for instance, if I ask someone, what's the weather in Egypt like, and they say, oh, it always rains, hardly ever a sunny break. The person may want to mislead me, or they don't know. Sometimes people don't know, but for cultural reasons they don't want to tell us that they don't know, so they lie because it saves their face. Another situation where we violate a maxim is really not a violation but opting out, when we cannot say what we already know and what someone else asks. So we may say things like, my lips are sealed, or I cannot tell you anything more about this, or this is confidential. These are ways of opting out and not answering a question, but at least we are telling them that that's what we are doing. And the third situation that I would like to mention is the so-called floating of a maxim. And this means that we violate a maxim in such a blatant way that the hearer is really faced with a problem. They have to make sense because they usually still assume that we are trying to cooperate. So it means that we have to try to make sense of what seems to be a completely unreasonable response, because we assume that the hearer is still following the principle of cooperation. And this is exactly what happens when we use the conversational implicature. Someone violates a maxim, we know that they are still cooperating, so we try to find a possible interpretation, and we do this through the so-called conversational implicature. So for instance, if someone says, two monkeys walk into the bar and one of them says, we know it's a joke. We know that we have to suspend our expectations of what the reality is. We don't suddenly think that our conversational partner went crazy and is talking about talking monkeys. So we know when to suspend certain beliefs in what reality is. When we talk to the elderly who are not suffering from dementia, they may violate Gricean maxims the same way everybody else does. They can do it unintentionally because they just don't know the answer. Sometimes we say things that are wrong because we are ignorant of what the situation is. Or they may do it intentionally for reasons such as not exposing your own ignorance, or because you want to deceive someone. So that's the same as with any healthy speakers. However, when we talk to elderly patients with Alzheimer's disease, when the speaker says something that is incorrect, the hearer usually corrects them. And the person may either accept the correction or not accept the correction. But if they don't accept correction, what we naturally do is we use the implicature reading of what people have said. So they say something that we know violates the maxims, and instead of just assuming that they don't know or they forgot the answer, we assume that there is a hidden meaning that we should try to get at. Patients with Alzheimer's disease pretty much violate all Gricean maxims. They violate the maxim of quantity by repetitions, by saying more than is necessary, sometimes by not saying anything, by lack of response. So they violate quantity maxim in every possible way. They violate the maxim of quality by saying things that we know are not true, by not recognizing faces that should have been familiar to them, by using wrong names or wrong words. They violate the maxim of manner by being ambiguous or saying things not in chronological order, by circumlocution, by ambiguity, etc. And they violate the maxim of relation by saying things that have no relationship to the conversation, or by not controlling what comes to their thoughts. So they obviously violate all Gricean maxims. And we should also remember that a lot of this is related to forgetting. People just forget what you have said 2 minutes ago. I had an elderly friend who had another elderly friend with Alzheimer's disease who one day called her every half an hour asking for time. And at some point, the friend who was healthy said, well, why are you calling me all the time, and every time you ask me about the time? Can't you just fix your watch? And the other friend said, well, but each time I call you say something different. And if you look at it from the point of view of someone who cannot fix the watch, the answer is really confusing. You know, every time you ask, it's a different answer. How can you put it into your mind? So forgetting and maxim violations go together quite a lot. But the problem is that the violation of Grice and Maxims by speakers with Alzheimer's disease are only perceived violations. Most violations are not intentional, so people don't mean to deceive you. And here probably we should make a distinction with people with mild Alzheimer's disease and people with advanced Alzheimer's disease, because people with mild Alzheimer's disease probably can still deceive you. They may still intentionally say things that are not true. So when they violate maxims, we should see this as unintentional in most cases. And we also have to remember that they don't follow a lot of other norms of polite behavior. So that's a different story altogether. However, our responses to their maxim violations are as if nothing had changed. So we talk to them as if we were dealing with healthy people. So if they say something that is wrong, we correct them. So if a person with Alzheimer's disease is crying and says, I want my mother to come and visit me, we may say something like, your mother has passed away 30 years ago, how do you want her to come? So we get frustrated, especially if it comes repeatedly, and we voice this translation by correcting the person. And if you think about it, if every time you say something, someone tells you, oh, you are wrong, you are wrong, you are wrong, you will no longer feel like you would like to have a conversation. It's the same way if you tell a child that they are stupid. They will really withdraw, they will not want to participate. So what our response is based on is the conversational implicature. We are reading into Alzheimer's disease speakers' words the intentions that we would normally associate with the words of a healthy person. But those intentions are not there. So the speaker finds it probably quite hurtful to be told repeatedly that they are wrong. And the hearer is quite sad because they don't really understand what is happening, why the person is saying things that they are saying. So there is a lot of anger and frustration on both sides. Here is another example when a person with Alzheimer's disease says, who are you? And the daughter says, I'm your daughter Irene. I don't have a daughter. I always knew that you never loved me. So we don't accept that the person just no longer recognizes the face. We try to interpret this message in the entire context of our life where we maybe didn't feel loved by the parent. And we are reading into this very sad statement that someone no longer recognizes someone, a lot of extra information that is hurtful. And it's very personal, but the intention was never there. It's not that the mother really wants to hurt the daughter. The mother doesn't know who that person is any longer. Another example was given by Maria Schreiber in her so-called Alzheimer project. She talked about the situation where she talked to her father about the sound of traffic that they were hearing, and the father kept talking about the sound of water, and she kept correcting him until she realized that if she went with his idea that it was water, they actually had a conversation about water and rivers and so on, and it doesn't matter that it wasn't water. It's really what is important is that they actually had a conversation, that no one got frustrated, that this conversation led to something else rather than a quarrel about what sound they were hearing. We could obviously talk about violations of politeness, but I think this is something that we can actually skip at this stage. One other thing I wanted to mention is that there is quite a lot of public face being added to Alzheimer's disease because of people who were public figures either acknowledging that they are suffering from Alzheimer's disease or when after they pass away, we learn that they were suffering from Alzheimer's disease. Very famous people here would be Ronald Reagan or Margaret Thatcher. The fact that those people with very active lives were suffering from Alzheimer's disease, it gives a public face to the problem. There is also quite a lot of information about educating general public on characteristics of Alzheimer's disease and so on, but I will move on to a topic that is perhaps more interesting for us. I would like to talk about the fact, I think we did something wrong with the sequencing of those
I think
slides,
so.
but that's okay. What I would like to say now is that when we talk about communication, spoken language, verbal language is just one way of communicating. Other than verbal language, there are other means of communication. And there is a very interesting book by Joanne Koenig-Koste, published in 2003, called Learning to Speak Alzheimer's. And she lists a number of tenets. And one of them is know that communication remains possible. Remember that the emotion behind failing words is far more important than the words themselves and needs to be validated. So even if the person no longer understands spoken language or cannot speak themselves, the person is still there, and emotions is the language that is still functioning. She also says we have to learn to live in the patient's world. And if verbal language fails, listen to their eyes. And that's the kind of communication that does not fail. There are several movies with people with Alzheimer's disease in them, either as one of the main characters or as a person in the background who is an element or catalyst in the film. And some of those movies are really for entertainment purposes, like The Notebook. But many of those movies actually give a lot of information about how to live with a person with Alzheimer's disease, and sometimes even how a person lives with Alzheimer's disease. So here are some of the examples of those movies. Feature films usually are portraying the situation from the point of view of the caregiver. So this is a little bit different than what we believe is happening in research now, when people are trying to put more emphasis on the person with Alzheimer's disease themselves rather than the caregiver. But those movies also show quite interesting points of view. One such movie is a movie about Iris Murdoch. That is based on a book written by her husband, who is trying to deal with a person who was very imaginative, who had a very rich inner life, and he just cannot believe that all this has been wiped out of her brain, that there is nothing left. And because we really don't know what is left, we should never dismiss the possibility that there is something of consequence in their left. So we should never treat a person with Alzheimer's disease as an empty shell, even if they cannot communicate. Some movies, like for instance, age-old friends, show communication communication of people with Alzheimer's disease or dementia among themselves. And it's actually quite interesting because those people don't have expectations of the other person. They can actually communicate quite well among themselves because they don't confuse each other. It's a little bit like immigrants who speak broken English. They usually can communicate quite well among themselves, often much better than they can communicate with native speakers. So a lot of interesting insights could be gained from films that talk about communication among people with Alzheimer's disease. In Age-Old Friends, they are portrayed as zombies who live in a zombie land, and that's how they talk about themselves. Another movie, Memory of a Killer, gives us some insights into the functioning of someone with Alzheimer's disease. It's a criminal, a murderer who is suffering from Alzheimer's disease, and he knows he has to kill someone, but he doesn't always remember why and all the circumstances. So, for instance, he writes everything he has to do or know on his arm. He invents all kinds of ways how to deal with the situation because he understands that he is in danger and he has a task to fulfill, but his memories are really fractured and incomplete. So it's a very interesting movie to look at how a person with Alzheimer's disease understands that they are losing parts of their memory. So this is a scene from that particular movie. He knows that his mind, his brain is empty. So what is important is that we can communicate in whichever way communication can happen. It could be language, but if language is no longer available, it could be non-verbal channels such as touch or movement or facial expressions or sounds like music. Music is amazingly therapeutic for people with dementia. Or any other gestures, and gestures not necessarily in the sense of body language, but things we can do for them by arranging the environment. And there are also ways to do things like, it's important to remember that we should not upset them, but we should try to keep the conversation going at any cost, because language is so important, communication is so important. We should suspend the filter from Grice and Maxims. We should forget about conversational implicature and just treat what they say at face value. And it's important to remember that it's not them doing things, it's the disease that is doing things that we don't like happening. So a person with Alzheimer's disease is still following a principle of cooperation, but they are doing it within their own version of reality and their own form of communication. And I think I will finish with one insight that I think is very important. People who are particularly good at communicating with seniors with dementia are children, because children have no established norms and they have no expectations. They are willing to adapt. So this is the conversation that we had before. I want my mother to come visit me. And our natural reaction would be, your mother has been dead for 30 years now, she cannot come. But a child would say, is your mother nice? Do you miss your mother? And you can continue the conversation. You don't have to, every time the person says something about her mother, you don't have to hammer it in, your mother is dead, your mother is dead. Well, it's a horrible thing. Even if you forget and you hear it again and again, why? What's the purpose? The person will forget it anyway. Why tell those horrible, painful things? If we could just keep the conversation going about something else. So I will stop here and just leave it with a picture of people talking to each other within their own age group, or people talking to each other across generations. It's very important that we just keep talking rather than arguing with each other. Thank you. I hope I didn't talk enough.
Thank you very much.
And please feel free to address questions to Vicky as well. I like doing this.
We'll open the floor for a conversation and some questions that you might have.
I haven't really had contact with those with Alzheimer's that I can think of anyway right now for very often. But recently, last month, someone who used to live next door to us, he did pass away. He was almost 92 or 95, I forget which, but he was, I called him Uncle, and hadn't seen him for quite a few years, but my mother told me that she had visited him at St. Peter's about 2 years ago. I didn't realize until I learned the day of his death, but she said that he did remember her, and so it's just one anecdote, but there are instances, aren't there, frequently where people with with Alzheimer's remember things from very, very, very long ago. And I guess that's really what we're saying when the person wants their mother to visit. And I guess my interest in that is what it implies for how we understand the changes they're experiencing, how to respond even better to that awareness. And I didn't get that out very well, but I think you're perhaps going to
I think one of the slides that we had was that in the movies, especially Age-Old Friends, and it highlighted the fact that there is no time frame for them. I'm going through this again. Not only my mother passed away, but now my brother's mother-in-law is also going through that. And she has, to her, 50 years ago is the same as half an hour ago. To her, it's melded. So the fact that her daughter keeps trying to say, well, no, you already ate. Mm-hmm. To her, it may not be. She may be thinking in her mind of a situation many years ago. And in the conversation where the woman said, I have no daughter, perhaps in her time frame when she was thinking, she didn't have a daughter, because she may not have been married yet, the daughter may not have been born yet, but we're always in understanding that it is now. It is, I'm talking now, I'm talking in the last half hour. Well, you ate. No, I didn't. Maybe I just got up in my time frame. And then we keep trying to correct them, and we keep trying to repeat the corrections, assuming that this will be learned. Mm-hmm. And it isn't. It can't. And I think that's the difference, where, again, if you've gone through teaching your child, you're saying, oh, well, this is almost the same thing, but it isn't. And so the same strategies that you used with teaching a child to talk cannot be used in this situation, because you have no idea what strategies are being used in the other person's mind. Mm-hmm. It is not the same as my mind. It's not set up the same as my mind.
I have a follow-up to the question about I want my mother. Lori Schindler-Martin, working at Shalom Village here, worked on the Alzheimer's ward, and with one of the concerns of the staff was frequent repeated questions. And one of them is, what time is lunch? What time is lunch? You move into a new institution and you figure you're going to miss lunch. But the other is, I miss my mother. I miss my mother. Where's my mother? So that's very frequent. And this one individual would come and and they would try to distract her, and distraction would work for about half an hour, and then it would start up again. So on a bad day, this is the question that would just come and come. So they were instructed, when they were beyond all their strategies, to ring for Lori. And Lori started to say, oh, well, tell me about your mother.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Exactly.
And exactly, oh, you must have loved your mother. Oh, and she called me this special name when I was a child. And she started writing that down. Exactly. And so then, she's called another time. She said, well, would you like to come over to my office and we could write more of your story? I've got some of it, but you could tell me more. So she would stand over the computer and dictate. Mm-hmm. And then later, when she was failing, where's my mother on a bad day? And Lori would come with the printout. Oh, did you know you've told us? And she just would be unbelieving that that this foreigner person I thought she'd never seen before, knew all these wonderful things about her mother. And when this woman died, she had a copy of that printout in every single pocket in every place in her room, because she would be given the story, but she would keep losing it. But there were all those times, and one of the really wonderful things about that, when you let her talk and tell the story and emotionally relate to the missing mother, is then the repetitive questions would not come up for a long, long time, maybe many, many days. So there'd be a satisfaction deep at the emotional level.
Because she was obviously, she was able to communicate whatever it
Into the
was,
world where
exactly,
she was.
whatever it was that was bothering her. Maybe it wasn't the fact that, where's the mother, but I feel lonely. I feel I have no emotional connection with someone, and I need to establish it. But I don't know how to establish it, so my only way of doing it is saying, where's my mother? So if we can go beyond the words, as Laurie did, and just and try and go with it, just go with the flow and see where it takes you. It's.
Yeah, there are several hands, and I don't know who is first, but I think
the gentleman was.
It's a more clarification question. I'm not a linguist at all, but am I getting it right? If do I understand you right when you say that these communication issues are not linked to the fact that people forget how to communicate, or language is still here in the brain, so that we don't lose that, but simply we use it in, let's say, what is change is our perception of the context. So we think that we are, let's say, 5-year-old, which may be also why we revert back to our first language. It's not that we forget English, it's simply that now we think we are 5-year-old, so yeah, we have to speak French, Polish, whatever we were speaking
Yeah, that's a way
when
of
we were
looking at
5-year-old.
it.
But and what does it tell us on the, I don't know, the way the brain works, that language is still there, but
That's something that we can't answer because we're not neurolinguists. There are others in our department that are trying to find out
do they
what.
do they have an answer?
I don't think they have an answer yet. I don't think they have an answer yet. Also because one of the problems is that we're trying to investigate language by using sometimes only words, and sometimes the words don't come back out. So we've got to try and find a different way of accessing that.
Because maybe also, what I find fascinating in what we're saying is that we say this is dementia, or we say this is Alzheimer's, and what I understand by dementia is that we don't know how to use tools that we used to know, or we had those tools in our brain, and now they're not functioning. That, to me, that's dementia. What I'm hearing now is slightly different, is we still have the tools, but we live in a different, it's perception. So perceptions are...
It's our perceptions.
Yeah, perceptions are altered,
Yeah.
but we still have the tools, which is very different. So it may not be dementia, it may be simply, maybe we change our perceptions when we get older, and maybe normal aging in a sense, not dementia, not, well, it's semantic, I guess, but still, it may make a big difference.
One of the researchers in our department, John Connolly, when we were talking about this with him, and we were talking about the fact of accessing what is in the brain, he said that he had a particular incident while he was at University College London. He was transporting a dementia patient, an Alzheimer's patient, from one center into London, and their car broke down. And he said, I have no clue about what goes, I know that I had to lift the hood and look under it. He kept saying, and the dementia patient kept saying, what's going on? What's going on? What's going on? And at one point he said, he lost it, he said, I don't know what's going on. I don't know what I'm looking at. He said, why don't you get out and help me, or something like this. Surprisingly, he said, the dementia patient did get out and did start moving parts of the car. He said, I have no idea what they were, but they actually were able to go. And the rest of the time, the patient was quiet, nothing. When he got to University College London, he recounted this, and they said, well, he was a top flight mechanic.
So the procedural memory is still there.
He was a top flight mechanic before this happened, and obviously he accessed it at that particular moment, for whatever reason, and we don't know why. So perhaps it is still there, but we just can't access it.
Yeah, John Connolly also works on people in coma,
In
vegetative
comas.
states. And he was able to find out that very often there is much more happening in the
Yeah.
brain than we actually believe there is. So people who were considered vegetative state patients were able to recover because they were in this locked-in state, but were able to get out of it. So I would hope to believe that hopefully, there is more happening in the brain of an Alzheimer's patient.
Sorry, I don't want to hijack the discussion, but if it's a matter of perception more than the tools are broken, then this makes sense, well, some kind of sense to try to change your perception than to tell somebody who says, I want to see my mother, to tell them, no.
Absolutely.
You're not 5-year-old. Your mother is not here anymore. Because if we don't do that, then we, in a sense, we say, okay, it's too late. There's nothing we can do. The tools are broken. That person is never going to recover. I'm not.
That's what we're saying.
I'm the devil's advocate here, but I can see some value in trying to say, not give up and say, no, you're not broken. You can still function. It's a matter of perception. I want to change your perception because I want you to have the right perception. Why not? After all, we do that with a lot of people, with addicts. We try to change their perception.
Yes, but I think we probably do better if we engage in a conversation about the mother and then slowly add the information rather than just say, oh, your mother is dead, your mother is dead. I think that's just hurtful.
And you may have had to abbreviate your lecture too much, and it was probably contained there, but it implies that the Grice and Maxims, we have to go beyond what we've been presented with, and we have more responsibility as the conversationalist who has the
exactly.
Yes, we are the ones who need to adapt.
Yeah. And I don't know whether you formally engaged in assessment of the Maxims and tried to, pursue his language or not in other parts of your work, but that would seem to be one of the implications of this awareness that we're describing.
There's a lot of really good work being done on the use of nonverbal communication, especially touch and facial expressions. And when dementia patients were asked, well, why did you pull that face? Or what does that face mean? They were able to give the correct interpretation.
About themselves.
So, exactly. And so what it is they may not be able to say, all right, I'm sick and tired of you harping at me, but this can give exactly the same interpretation, but we're just not used to picking up on those cues because we're very much still a verbal culture, whereas many other I'm thinking of, if you haven't already figured it out, I'm Italian. There is much more in my gestures, my facial expressions that would totally violate many of the Grecian maxims, and many cultures are like that, where the gestures or the facial expressions are much more important, or even sounds. There are many cultures in the world where words are not used, but particular sounds. And everyone knows what the meaning is. And so I think what we need to do is move away from words, whether they're written or spoken, but there's other ways of communicating.
Yeah, I don't have too much experience with this outwardly, but I know, or personally, but I know people with Alzheimer's might sometimes say things that are rude or aggressive and potentially very hurtful to those around them. So have you thought about how we might communicate in those situations?
One I think was one of the ones that you left out was the whole idea of politeness. And politeness is impolite only because we have social norms. And we have deemed that behavior X in context Y is impolite, but behavior X in context W is okay. So the person, again, who has lost the social norms for good conversation has also lost the social norms for what is polite or impolite in any situation. So that's the reason why this may come out. I know that our first reaction right off, and that's from personal experience, is you want to hit them. But that you can't do. And I think what I then learned to do was just say, oh, go on, and then just skip over it and try and figure out what it was that they were trying to say, or what it was that I was doing at the time that didn't go sit well with them. And one of especially with my mom, was the fact of saying out in public, well, don't you have to go to the bathroom? Because I knew it was time. And it was very demeaning to her. It was very, it was embarrassing to, in a room of people, some of which, this was at a wedding, some of which she knew very well, but others that she didn't know very well. And so I think, and so her answers at the time were rude and yes, hurtful. But what was it? Let's step back for a minute and say, okay, what was it that maybe I did at the time? Or what is it that she's trying to say, but this is the only way that she knows how to say it, because the words might not be coming. But that's perhaps a situation that has been imprinted in her mind, and that's the way she's able to get that idea across.
Yeah, aggression is very often an expression of high level of frustration, and an inability of expressing this frustration in any other way. So, but it can be really difficult.
I just wanted to ask a question about sort of pauses and silence and how that kind of factors into conversation. Because what my experience has been is when engaging in conversation with someone who has dementia, in particular advanced stage dementia, is that it's very slow, and that their retrieval of answers tend to be slow as well. And I find that like our social norms are very much that you state a question and you expect a response right after.
Yeah.
And it's interesting, and I sort of have learned that over time. But when you're watching others, and certainly yourself sometimes too, is that you notice that sometimes you're not waiting for that. So I was wondering if you could just make a comment on that, or if you had any suggestions in terms of strategies to kind of, I guess, in a way, be patient, but also kind of facilitate the conversation.
It's interesting that you bring up the idea of silence and the fact that it's our cultural norm that there has to be X amount of time before there is a reply. In many other cultures, that is not the case. And if you have a reply, a very quick reply, that is seen as rude because you really haven't considered my question. And you haven't, I need the time. It's respectful to you of my putting in the time to think about what it is. So again, some of the interpretation problems, it's because it's our time frame. And again, it's not their time frame. So again, you've learned, as I did, to gauge it personally. And sometimes what you may is just sort of repeat the question and say, oh, what about this? Which was a question that you had asked 5 minutes ago, but you haven't had an answer to.
Sometimes when I'm in the same situation, and I'm not sure if it's a memory issue, a processing issue, or they're just taking the time